Well, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. I had the chance to engage with Ani recently in Quito at Habitat 3 and learn a little bit more about WRI. And then, as he mentioned, I'm spending a good part of today learning more about the work that you're doing. But I really appreciate this opportunity to give you a little bit of a sense of the work that we're doing at the Gates Foundation and frankly, around the world through working with all of our partners. The team is the Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene team. But a few years ago, we decided to focus completely all of our efforts on sanitation, with this aspiration, the universal use of sustainable sanitation services. Now, we did this because, frankly, we saw a huge market failure, in particular in urban sanitation, where what you have is one system that's like, well over 100 years old that the entire developing world relies on. That frankly is not at all what one would design today. It's incredibly wasteful, it's incredibly expensive, this idea of miles and miles of sewer lines, a lot of electricity used to pump our waste around, and that waste is transported by potable water. I mean, it's kind of a wild design. I work with this amazing professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa, Chris Buckley, and he says, if you dried your average person's feces for a year, that would be 11 kilograms of feces. You can put it in a small backpack. All the pathogens that make people sick are in that. And we use 180,000 liters of water a year, thereby polluting 180,000 liters of water a year with that 11 kilograms of feces. So it's a wild design we have, but it frankly is one of the most impressive investments in public health and innovations in public health that's ever been made. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how to come up with different approaches, new approaches. I like to say there's one gold standard for urban sanitation. We're trying to come up with another that's just as appealing to users, to the citizens of the city, but that has far more qualities and delivers a much higher return on investment. Now, one of the things that's really fun about working at the Gates Foundation is we think of ourselves as catalysts. And Bill and Melinda and Warren Buffett are always encouraging us that we should have the highest appetite for risk of all philanthropic dollars out there. So if we see something that is kind of a bit of a moonshot, it seems like it's very high risky, a lot of potential that it will fail to materialize impact. But if it worked, it could be tremendously impactful and really change the trajectory of development. That's a perfect investment from their perspectives. It's a hard thing to do, but actually one of the things that's fun is some of the investments we'll be talking about today that, for instance, reinventing the toilet, really are things that started out kind of almost thought of as crazy in terms of their aspirational nature, but have such high potential to impact poor people around the world and transform how communities make progress that we feel they're worth making. Now, I mentioned that we focus first on sanitation, and then in fact almost all of our investments these days are on urban sanitation and are coming up with an alternative to sewers. And where there's a huge focus on sustainability, and that includes therefore economic sustainability, and on safety. Now, I mentioned a little bit about public health. The estimate is half of all trips to the hospital in developing countries are a direct result of somebody coming into contact, being sick, because of poor sanitation. In other words, they came into contact with somebody else's germs, fecal-borne pathogens. It's a huge issue, and it's not just a public health issue. The World Bank has done an analysis and says that it costs the world $260 billion a year, just purely poor sanitation. And if you look at India, over $50 billion a year of lost GDP in India, over 5% of their GDP. So it's a huge economic issue, huge public health issue, and then frankly, it's a huge dignity issue and quality of life issue. As any of you who have spent nearly as much time as in the slums of the developing world as I have. Now, one interesting thing is it's not like this is a new challenge. It's not like everybody in the world is connected to a sewer line except the people in these newly growing, fast-growing slums in the developing world. Today, you already have 2.7 billion people who are using what we call on-site sanitation. So they're using toilets connected to a pit or a septic tank. So in other words, they're using sanitation that requires emptying. And if you empty it, then what do you do with it? So emptying it and transportation. So that's 2.7 billion people today around the world. I grew up in Montreal, in Canada. We were, a suburb not too far from the city center. We weren't on a sewer network. I don't know if it even is today. We had septic tanks, but we had a full system that worked. So an interesting thing is this going to go away? Do we really have a path to sewers for everybody? And one of the challenges I think that frankly most people don't think about, even people in the development space, is what they'll have one set of conversations around development. We'll acknowledge that there's no community that's pulled themselves out of poverty without addressing sanitation and reducing that public health burden. If you ask them, what is that going to look like? The assumption is it's going to look like how we solve the problem. Not as many people have visited as many wastewater treatment plants in developing countries as I have. And you find these plants that were built beautiful. I mean, they got all the capital that they needed from development banks to build the right stuff. They just don't have the ongoing resources to keep them functioning. So I've seen treatment plants where half of the aeration ponds are not working simply because they can't afford the electrical bill. Or where you have a system, part of the system that's down because they don't have a part, which may be inexpensive, or they have the part but they don't have the capability, the knowledge. They don't have the person who knows how to replace it. And if you look into how systems in Washington, D.C. or Seattle, where I live, function year after year, there's a huge amount of skilled labor doing a lot of preventive maintenance that is a good part of the cost. But if you don't do that preventive maintenance, you have remarkably expensive shutdowns. So it's a system that is challenging on the economic standpoint. But as I mentioned, it also is a system that demands massive quantities of water to work. So what this shows is a projection, and this is a room that understands this better than almost anyone. There are already a lot of cities in developing countries that are suffering from water stresses today. And if we look at both where the population growth and the urban migration is, there's an amazing overlap with cities that are facing water stress. And that's not even taking into account some of what we expect in the face of climate change. So we think that basically the challenge of providing water to sanitation systems is going to get to be increasingly challenging, and that there's no way to do that without having that being competing for all the other critical uses of water resources. So if you've tracked the Millennium Development Goals, you'll know that sanitation was the last goal that was added. And the focus was reduced by 2015, reduced by half the number of people that don't have access to an improved toilet. And so it only really talked about toilet. And so let's just, and so most people don't really think about urban sanitation as a problem. It wasn't a problem from an MDG perspective because most people in most developing cities, even poor people, are using toilets. This was a slide that I first saw. I was about 3 months into the role. I started at the foundation 3.5 years ago. And this one slide, I've maybe made it look a little different, but it's basically a similar slide that was presented by the Water and Sanitation Program folks from the World Bank. It's actually based on data from a study that my team previously had funded. But it just shows what is the waste flow in a typical city. What we're going to look at is data from DAKAR, Bangladesh. So a huge and very fast-growing city. And after I saw this in the presentation in Stockholm World Water Week, I was like, that in one slide told my story better than I've been able to tell it, and my team's story as to why addressing urban sanitation is so critical. So it starts, what we're going to look at is the whole, the service chain for sanitation, from containment all the way down to reuse or disposal. And it starts by just pointing out that in Dhaka, 20% of all people in the city use a toilet that's a flush toilet connected to a sewer system. 79% use a toilet connected to a pit or a septic tank. Or actually, what you'll see is it's not really a septic tank for the typical case. It's a containment vessel, but with an overflow pipe to the street, in effect. Only 1% are open defecating. So from the MDG perspective, this city is like 99% green. It's positive. It's really good. Anybody who's really spent much time in Dhaka knows that it is not really good from a sanitation perspective. And here's a little bit of an understanding of why. So those septic tanks that I mentioned that have the overflow, what it means is they fill up, and then every time someone flushes, you basically have that very pathogen-rich, all the disease of anyone in that household is pouring into the gutter in the street, maybe like a few feet from the toilet. So that's where, you know, kids are playing in the streets, dogs are running around. It is massively unsanitary, and so there's an incredibly high likelihood that that's then going to infect anybody else in the community with the same diseases that household has. So 69% flowing directly into the immediate, contaminating the immediate environment. Now, you see 20% goes into the sewer system. The one problem is in Dhaka, they haven't really put any focus on non-sewer sanitation at all. You talk to anybody at the city level, they will say that the future is about connecting everybody to sewers. And so it has not been an area of focus, even though it's 79% of the waste stream. So the remarkable bottom line for Dhaka is of all the human waste in that city, 2% is getting treated. So from a sanitation perspective, this is really like 2% positive, 98% negative. Some amazing takeaways here. You see that of the 20% that goes into a sewer line, 9% leaks without ever reaching the treatment plant. And what you have, just like we did in North America years ago before codes were changed, typically they trench once, and so you've got sewer lines right next to water lines. You have water lines that basically have leaks, you have sewer lines that have leaks. And even worse, what you have is water lines that are pressurized that lose pressure because they're not 7x24 delivering water. So every now and then they go negative pressure, sucking all the water around them, which is sewer water. So a huge reason for poor drinking water in all these developing cities are situations like that, are like directly contaminating the water supply from the sewer supplies. So 9% doesn't make it to the treatment plant. Another 9% makes it to the treatment plant but doesn't get treated for whatever reason and just goes into whatever receiving body of water. Treatment plants are always next to bodies of water. And what you see is the 2% that gets effectively treated. There's no system for, if you have a pit that's full, you absolutely get your pit emptied, but there's no place for that person to then legally dump it. So they dump it into a body of water or, you know, basically an open lot, oftentimes as close as they can get away with to where they picked it up, because their costs are all driven by how much fuel is it going to take for them to do that round trip to drop that waste somewhere and come back and service the next household. So an incredibly terrible story here. Now I'm going to walk through just one more city that actually has thought about this a little bit more, and that actually is the city of Dakar, Senegal. Now Dakar starts off very similarly. Only 2% open defecating, 73% using either pit latrines or septic tanks, 25% connected to sewers. Now what's different here is they actually have mechanisms and regulations that are enforced to a certain degree around what safe emptying looks like. And they have places within Dakar that you can actually drop off the waste and have it get treated. Now what they also have is they have more land than in Dhaka. So they also have, in some parts in the city, the ability to just say, okay, that pit's full, we're kind of cover it up, use another pit, and let it just compost. But at the end of the day, they still have results that are quite poor. Less than a third of all waste is getting treated in Dakar, or at least were when this data was collected in 2012. Now, again, what's amazing, if you look at the 25% that goes into a sewer, I think 5% leaks, 17% is not effectively treated. Of the 31%, that just only makes up 3%. And it's not like it's easy to solve all those problems. Think about what would need to be, what you'd need to do to solve that have everything that goes into a sewer line be 100% treated. And it's massive capital expense. It's digging up roads, and it's much more operating expense as well. So that hopefully gives you like a bit of a grounding of like what does sanitation look like in these cities and why is this a problem that needs to be addressed. So I mentioned briefly that the MDGs really had only focused on one aspect of this problem, and that is containment. And so one of the things, the first things we really engaged on a few years ago as the SDGs were coming together is we need to make sure that the Sustainable Development Goals and our focus for the next 15 years and what's getting measured, because that's what's going to get managed, looks at the whole end-to-end challenge. And so very happy to say that no longer is the goal just getting improved toilets. The goal is getting improved, safely managed toilets. And how that is defined is toilets where the waste gets treated. So toilets that to get to 100% green, you have to solve all the problems that we saw on the last slide. So a fantastic step forward. We don't yet have a baseline. It'll be 2017 when we'll get the first baseline and we'll see how we're doing. We'll also see, frankly, a lot of developing countries where you've got wastewater treatment plants that really aren't doing any treatment. So I think it'll, because one of the things about the SDGs is that we're measuring them worldwide, not just in developing countries. So I think that will be fascinating, will lead to a lot of pretty interesting conversations around the SDG numbers. When I'm asked, so based on the work that you've done around the world, what do you see as kind of the key things that are necessary to actually start to make some progress against this challenge? The first thing is political will, and this is a huge challenge. There's a taboo around talking about sanitation. Those diagrams I told you before, you know, all of us in the sanitation world, we affectionately call those shit flow diagrams, and SFDs when we're in a more polite company. You guys get to be like in the inner circle and everybody out there. But obviously, politicians don't like talking about that. And so in some ways, it's like trying to get momentum addressing HIV/AIDS back when nobody was at all comfortable talking about it, because you couldn't talk about that without talking about sex. We have a similar problem where we've got a huge public health crisis here, but but politicians and many other stakeholders don't really want to even talk about it. So the political will to make changes and invest and prioritize is hugely important. Now the next level is there anybody that actually is accountable for it? And again, oftentimes we'll find sanitation is not in any clear ministry or in any clear office at a municipal level. It's spread across multiple agencies, so nobody basically worries that they're going to get fired if they don't make progress. Nobody wakes up in the morning figuring out how do I really kind of do the best that we can do in this space. And in the places like DAKAR, where you actually have a coherent a utility, ONAS, that feels real ownership for sanitation end to end, it's way easier to make progress and really move the ball forward. This terminology, FSM, fecal sludge management, is critical, and it's a whole system, as you've seen, and so successful planning is critical, something that all of you know. If you want to make any impact, you really have to understand how to plan. And then what I'll spend much of the rest of the talk about is really around innovations. But a lot of times people think that innovations, they just think about shiny new stuff. I know this is a more sophisticated group. For instance, we think that the way that you structure the marketplace, the way a government builds an enabling environment for entrepreneurs to be able to engage in solving this problem is critically important and requires a lot of innovations. And certainly financing innovations are desperately necessary here as well. And then, of course, you can't just build these systems in the lab and hope that they'll work, or change the way collection systems work if you don't understand what the challenge is and what people think about at the household level. And then the different ways that we engage and the different networks of partners that we have to try to address these challenges kind of also cover a number of different areas. Urban sanitation markets, it's an initiative and a team in my group that's completely focused on understanding the markets as they exist today and understanding what interventions at a market level, at a citywide level, might have an impact. It's interesting, we're at the Gates Foundation, we're really the only team that focuses specifically on urban environments and on changing how urban systems are governed and structured. And so a lot of work happening here. And one of the amazing things, when I first came to the team, as Ani mentioned, I wasn't a sanitation expert. You know, I'd done a lot of innovation in the software space. I'd been spending some time in the clean tech space, so innovating in, you know, three-dimensional real stuff, but didn't know a lot about sanitation. So when I joined, I asked the team, so tell me, what are the cities in sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia that really have this figured out, that are models for us to follow? And I have 3 people on my team, 4 now, that were like, you know, multiple decades in this space, you know, world-class experts. Silence. This has not been figured out. There's no city, even in South Africa, that really has, across sub-Saharan Africa, that has figured this out. There's no city in South Asia that has figured this out. So it makes it really difficult. We don't know yet what's going to work, and therefore we don't know yet what to try to scale. And so what we're doing is we're investing in a lot of different things that we think hold promise, and we have some very early feedback that many of these are working. And at the same time, we're investing in a platform for scaling things. So we're investing with the optimism that we are going to find solutions that can scale, and in parallel, we're trying to build networks across cities, across practitioners, educators, et cetera, networks that will allow the things that prove to make the most sense to scale as quickly as possible. And this is an area where I think there's a lot of expertise in this room and in this organization that will be very helpful in us and our partners figuring this out. You may have heard at the Gates Foundation, one of the things that we focus on in every team is capturing evidence, building an evidence base kind of as a public good, but also making sure that we're not leading ourselves down some garden path that's not going to get us to where we want to go. And so it means measurement and evaluation is a key part of all the upfront work we do when we're trying to figure out a new space, and then all of our investments. Is it really having the impact that we think it's going to have? So one thing that's interesting is that I said we're mostly focused on urban. That hasn't always been the case. We probably spent over the course of the previous 10 years, maybe $180 million on figuring out what works to get people to use toilets from within a rural environment. And so we have a lot of multi-year grants. Some of them finished last year, some of them finishing this year, some of them finishing next year, and a huge body of evidence that should inform the way to develop all the programs to address the rural sanitation challenges. So that's the dissemination for scale that we're actively engaged in right now. And hopefully, a few years from now, we'll be actively engaging in disseminating for scale some of the new innovations in the urban space that we're working on. We focus a lot, of course, on policy advocacy and communications, and just a couple examples of this that have been remarkably valuable in the last 2 years is every now and then we get surprised when a government says sanitation is a priority. So for instance, none of us on my team expected that Prime Minister Modi in India would be such a champion for sanitation. So he got elected in 2014, and he immediately made it a priority. He spoke about it in his first Red Fort speech, and since then he's been an incredible champion for sanitation. He's created the Clean India or Swachh Bharat mission. So that opened up a window of opportunity. We now have a couple full-time people from my team in India. We have a program management unit that has basically seconded a bunch of talent into the Ministry of Urban Development to help shape the policies there. And we have similar partnerships with the states of Tamil Nadu, of Orissa, and of Andhra Pradesh to try to capitalize on this new political will and opportunity. Similarly, a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago maybe, President Xi in China talked about the need for a toilet revolution. So our engagement now in China is much deeper. We were already talking to companies there about potentially commercializing some of the technologies, but now there's a whole other opportunity for us to capitalize on that political will. And what it's doing is creating a new market for all these technologies. And we can talk about more of that a little bit later. And then I want to drill down a little bit more into probably the initiative that has gotten the most attention, and that is transformative technologies. Could we invent new approaches to sanitation that could actually change the curve? And I'll drill into that into a minute. On urban sanitation markets, just one more level of detail. One of the things, so we're doing a number of different innovation investments in different cities. We're also trying to figure out what would it mean to have a model city, to answer the question that I had when I first joined the team, to have, at the city level, a place where we could point to and say, take a look at what they've learned, take a look at what they've done. And I'll drill into a little bit of some of the work we've done in DAKAR, where you see that different interventions connect in a systemic way to deliver much faster improvements in sanitation. And then again, talking about building the platform for replication. Then finally, we have these technologies, but we're already figuring out what would it mean for a company to be able to introduce a reinvented toilet to this marketplace. What would you want the procurement policies to look like to be supportive of that? What would you like standards and certifications and regulations to look like that would help kind of adopt a new technology? And so a lot of work is going in there, again, as a public good that then any company that participates in the space can take advantage of. Okay, so we're going to dive into technology a little bit here and some of the innovations on that front. And there were really, when the team first looked at, okay, what are the economics of pit emptying and transport and treatment? Why is it so expensive for a poor household to get their pit emptied, for example? And therefore, how could we transform systems in ways that would really make a difference? One of the places they looked at was emptying. So we have a body of work, a portfolio of investments that we are nerdy. I think there are some nerdy people maybe in the room. We come up with these funny names. This is the Omni-Ingester portfolio. Systems that can ingest everything that's in that pit or that septic tank and treat it. Now here we've had some investments that have actually proven to be really successful. It turns out that there are many pit latrines in developing countries that are too far from the road for a vacuum truck to be able to reach, or that are too dry, so the pumps just can't pump the contents. So we've actually worked with engineering firms and invented some new approaches to pumping that can solve both of those problems, and those are going quite well. But this is also the area where we have a dream. We have an aspirational goal that has been really challenging. We haven't cracked the nut yet. We probably had made well over like 8, 10 different investments that haven't proven out, but we still have a few investments that are in the hopper. And this is, imagine right now, a truck drives in, empties 1 or 2 pits till the truck is full, then has to drive outside of town to where they're supposed to dump the load. And that typically is way out of town for obvious reasons. Nobody wants it near where they live because it's a smelly place and requires a lot of land, and because typically what they just do is they just dump it out and it dries under the sun. So, so we're saying, what would it take to basically change the economics of that system? We said, imagine if you had a system where you could pump all the contents from a pit onto the back of the truck, separate the liquids from the solids, treat the liquids so that there's no smell, no pathogens that would make anybody sick, and then just leave them behind. That's actually clean water that might even have some really beneficial use in that community, but certainly has no harm. And then you could actually empty a number of pits and then only make that truck roll when your truck's full of the solids, and that would dramatically change the economics. And therefore, make sure that people are using these systems instead of paying some poor person to manually empty the pit and dump it nearby, which is what happens many, many, many times over every day in every one of these cities. So like I said, that's an area where it turns out that technically that's super challenging. So we're still working on it, but we don't have a solution yet that is working in the field. But that's our first portfolio. The next portfolio is, again, thinking of the same economics and the same systems. Imagine if you didn't have to drive way outside of town to take the waste. Imagine if you had some kind of a treatment plant that was way smaller, used a lot less land, didn't smell, didn't create negative emissions, so all the effluents were clean, the air, the solids, the liquids, killed all the pathogens, so that what came out of it was completely safe. And the other kind of like requirement for something to be an omniprocessor in our book is generate some output that has commercial value that you could sell. And this is a portfolio where we actually have a lot of exciting advances and some of them that are actually working in the field, and I'll drill into 2 of the most mature ones in a moment. Then the last thing, of course, is this reinvented toilet. And that starts from an idea of, like, imagine if you had a toilet and that toilet became its own treatment plant. So that what comes out of the toilet had no pathogens, no disease, could never make anyone sick. So it's really a vision where containment equals treatment and gives you the opportunity for easy reuse or disposal. Now, so the definition of a reinvented toilet is something that requires no water line coming in. It requires no sewer line going out. So it's completely standalone, and even requires no 7x24 connection to electricity. So some of the designs, for instance, have a small solar panel. So that's the definition. And the other thing is, all of these have economic requirements as well. In this case, it's fully burdened costs, including the cost of the toilet amortized over the lifetime and all the operational costs, no more than 5 cents per user per day. And that number was chosen because that's the price that many slum dwellers in developing cities in Africa and South Asia are already spending. So we know that there's a willingness to pay, and we know that this would be a massive improvement. So we think that if technology can reach that price point, it doesn't solve the problem for the poorest of the poor, but it's a huge market. And then you start going down the price curve. So our aspiration is to get to a penny per user per day. But how do we get onto that curve that starts with cell phones that are $1,000 and gets down to cell phones that are $40? How do we start to do that in this completely new space? So let's take a look at just a couple of examples. So one of the amazing things here is we've probably made investments to 50 different ideas. But we still have over 8 ideas that are actually looking incredibly promising. In other words, they're taking the energy from our feces to drive some process that is killing all the pathogens in the waste stream. We have these first two, the one that was designed by Loughborough and the one that was designed by Caltech. Actually, we have toilets in the field being used by people who don't work for the Gates Foundation or for these universities, and we're getting feedback. And I'm now engaging with companies who are either in the business already of making toilets or of making appliances of a different kind to get excited about going into a new business, which is making these new kinds of appliances. And that is actually a very fun conversation. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, I just wanted to give you a sense of how these 3 different designs, each designed by a group of technologists and scientists, approaches the problem. Loughborough University takes the solids and the liquids, and basically it's like a pressure cooker. So increases the heat and the pressure, and that waste undergoes what's called hydrothermal carbonization. It actually emits energy in the form of heat and kills all the pathogens. So what comes out of this toilet looks like used, and actually kind of smells like used coffee grounds. So completely sterile, would be a good soil amendment for your garden, like would be a net positive thing. And the liquid doesn't smell and has no pathogens. So again, your garden would love it. A version of this toilet was used by a family in China for 3 months. They're on the 11th floor of an apartment building. They were taking the solids that came out and then putting it in their normal toilet and flushing it away, I learned. But it was, makes sense, I guess, and it was easy. And it was a fairly large size. It was like the size of a bookshelf, a cabinet. And the next version already was about 1/3 of the size. And so we're at that point of the development where we're getting them to work. We're proving that they do the things that we didn't even know were possible, which is kill all the pathogens using a very, very low energy budget, not requiring incoming water or sewer lines. So incredibly exciting progress. And there's now, this is now being further developed and further refined and further tested, for example, in DAKAR. The second toilet design from Caltech is basically an electrochemical reactor. So Caltech invented a new electrode coating that is far more efficient at breaking down through this electrochemical process all of the pathogens and organics in our waste stream. So again, what comes out of this toilet is sterile solids and sterile liquids, and very small amounts of sterile solids. So a completely different approach. This is a toilet that has a solar panel on the top. That's what's powering the unit. Here, for the Caltech toilet, the Loughborough toilet, an interesting thing is on paper, there's enough heat generated by this process that one could imagine capturing enough of that heat that you turn into electrical energy, that's what kickstarts the next process. So it's theoretically possible that this is a toilet that's completely off-grid, self-sustained in all dimensions. At this point, we're trying to reduce that energy use, and so we're not there yet, but it would kind of be an amazing thing. The theoretical possibilities, you could also charge your cell phone. You know, you would have some amount of excess energy. And what we know is that, you know, if you provide a family with their first 10 watts of energy, that is transformative. That is powering a cell phone and powering a solar lantern, and it changes people's lives. So we know that version 1 is not the end, that there are aspirations yet to achieve. And then the last one, very briefly, RTI's design actually separates out the liquids and solids and has two different processes where they combust the solid, and that generates some energy that powers the sanitization of the liquids. So just giving you a sense that there was like an amazing amount of innovation here. To our knowledge, nobody was working on trying to come up with a toilet that kills all the pathogens. Now, one question I often get is, and in the US, a lot of people have experienced a composting toilet. So isn't that good enough? One of the challenges with composting toilets, and frankly with any biological approach, is we've not found yet a biological toilet that kills the hardiest of the pathogens. So like a great example is helminths, or soil-transmitted helminths, which are really intestinal worms, or the eggs of intestinal worms. So these are like a huge, huge burden. You have, the belief is that 2 billion people on the planet are currently suffering from intestinal worms. And that gets perpetuated through poor sanitation. And so this is a case where you can actually there's very cheap drugs to get rid of them. It's nasty. It happens in communities on a regular basis. School children take this drug and have to eliminate the eggs. But then they very quickly kind of get reinfected. So this is an example where we set a pretty high bar. We said all of these technologies, whether it's the omniprocessor or the reinvented toilet, needs to kill helminth eggs and stop this transmission and get rid of the scourge forever. And that turns out it makes it that much harder to come up with an approach. But like we see, we have a handful of them that are working well. Okay, so now I think my last two slides are what about the bigger things, the omniprocessors? Give me an example of those. This is one that basically takes fecal sludge as an input and generates biochar. So again, doesn't smell bad, has no disease-carrying pathogens, and in fact has value. You could sell it because it could be used either as a soil amendment or as a replacement for charcoal or other biomass that you sell. And we've got a few of these units that are currently operating in India, and a plan to take it to the next level, more testing. This unit, we think, would cost about $60,000 to build, and would serve the needs of around 12,000, a community of around 12,000. And this next one, how many people have seen a video where Bill Gates drinks poop water? Well, the poop perfume is a very new one. I just tweeted that today. That's right. So he was actually on Jimmy Fallon, and there were 2 glasses of water, one that came out of this machine that is powered by fecal sludge, and one which was purportedly not. And he's like, okay, Jimmy, turn around and I'll let you drink whichever one you want. And I encourage you to watch that. It was pretty fun. And yes, people ask me, so Bill Gates did go, visited this plant, drank the water that came out of it, which was absolutely poop like moments before. And yes, I had to drink water out of that machine before Bill would drink water out of that machine. This is pretty remarkable. It's got a small footprint. It can fit in like 2 shipping containers. So it doesn't require a lot of land. The emissions pass Washington State emissions, which apparently are the most stringent in the country. So there's no smell, no harmful air emissions. What comes out is an ash that is sterile, and 70,000 liters a day of distilled water, of incredibly high quality water that could either be polished and made potable, or it could be used for any industrial requirement that needs incredibly high quality water. So what happens is fecal sludge comes in, it gets dried and then burned, that generates steam that goes through a steam engine that generates electricity. And all of that has been innovated in. So for instance, there's no steam engine that could do this job on the market today, so this involved inventing a very specific steam engine. And so the remarkable thing is it generates 300 kilowatts ongoing of electricity, but it requires less than 50 kilowatts to run. And so you've got 250 kilowatts that you can sell. And the first unit, the only one that's in operation today, is in Dakar, Senegal. And it was sited where the trucks go to drop off the fecal sludge, which happens to be right next to the wastewater treatment plant. So this is now generating electricity that is reducing the bills of the wastewater treatment plant. So again, from an economic standpoint, we don't know where this is going to completely land at the end of the day, because we're building unit number 2 today. But we know that it's going to be a lot cheaper than any other way of actually doing treatment of sludge. The first dream is to make sure that you're making more money from the electricity and sales of the water, if you have them, to cover all your operating costs. So that way you provide the capital for this, and then you know that it's not going to stop running because it's making money every month. And you could actually have a private operator running it as a business, and that would work very well. But the aspiration is like figuring out under what circumstances a value for, what would the cost of electricity have to be? What would the value of the water have to be? And in some cases, it also generates a lot of heat. So we've talked, we hosted a member of parliament from Mongolia who said, that heat is incredibly commercially valuable in Ulaanbaatar, like 9 months of the year. And so this would absolutely pay for itself in short order in that environment. So we're figuring out, like, in what circumstances could you imagine this having first a 10-year payback and actually being a net positive asset, which of course is kind of remarkable to think about in the sanitation space. As I said, this one is also the second instance of this is being built right now. We completely bringing in a new steam engine. So a lot of remarkable innovation is happening. But I'm also spending time on the road. I was just in China a few months ago. So I was talking to Benoit about the interesting work you guys are doing in waste to energy in China. Companies in China are saying, if this could take the sludge that comes out of a treatment plant and burn it without any other co-fuels and generate electricity, we could sell a lot of these in China. So again, we're at the point now where we believe there's a huge business opportunity, and we're trying to find the company that would want to take this intellectual property and go to market with it. And of course, the way that we have global access requirements on all of our partners, which means that if we provide the intellectual property, we or our partners who we have funded provide the intellectual property, the company commits to basically serving charitable purposes with having a certain percentage of all of the machines that they have be in developing world, which therefore means that they need to make them available, accessible, and affordable to the poor. So that's the way that we see hitting scale and hitting impact. And as I hope is kind of obvious from all of these conversations, is that we believe that something's not likely to be sustainable unless it's economically viable, and ideally that means profitable. So as soon as you can break the profit curve on a new business model, people will scale it up. And so from the beginning, our technologies are destined to go to a company that is going to serve a market need and generate a profit and have a sustainable growing business. And our definition of when we can get out of this business is when we've got multiple companies competing for the right to sell the best reinvented toilet to every poor consumer in the world, and similarly competing for the value, for generating value out of fecal sludge. The last slide, which I forgot about, was to just give you a sense of what about the non-technical innovations? What would be an example of that? And this was a series of interventions we did in Dakar. So we deeply first researched how does the pit emptying, transport, and treatment work in that city. And then we did a few different things. Turns out that if you want to get your pit emptied in Dakar, you have to find a truck and then negotiate with the owner of that truck or the driver of that truck And then you wait at home for whenever they're going to come. They come, they see it, they typically renegotiate. It's bigger than I thought, it's further from the road, et cetera. It's a very difficult process, and it can take days because the treatment plant was only open 30 hours a week. And the truck didn't want to empty your pit if they couldn't take it to the treatment plant. So what we did was we created a call center. People call and say, I'm at this address and I would like my pit emptied. The call center sends a text message to 10 or 12 different truck operators and say, do you have an hour to bid on the opportunity to empty this pit? So there was also a lot of price fixing and collusion, so prices were artificially high in DAKAR. Within 6 months, the price of getting your pit empty dropped by on the order of 28%. But what was more is you got very, very quick turnaround. And then the call center would call back the next day and say, did you get the service you expected at the price you expected? And so there was a feedback loop that improved this over time. Truck operators couldn't get loans, and so we provided a loan guarantee to a commercial bank, and they're now providing loans to help them fix up their trucks or even buy new ones. And then we worked with ONAS, the utility, who was losing money most months on providing the treatment plant. And now what they did was they basically set that out for tender. And a woman who owned 4 trucks and was the head of the emptying truck association bid on the right to run that plant, is now making a profit. So she shares some of that profit back with the utility. So they're now making money even though they no longer have that responsibility. She has a profitable business. She wants to scale up that business. But the other amazing thing is within 6 months, it went from being open 30 hours a week to 60 hours a week. And they're getting twice as many trucks dropping off their load, which means that like what was happening to that waste before then. And the other amazing thing is I visited it. It actually looks much nicer. There are flowers and gardens at this sludge treatment plant. The woman who was running it happened to be a young woman, actually second trimester pregnant, and she was basically directing the trucks and was quite proud of talking about both how operationally they had improved so much, more hours, but also was quite proud about the fact that this was no longer an eyesore and a place that the neighbors were embarrassed of. So it was really interesting, and it was all this work that made it the clear place for us to take the first Omni processor, where we've got all these partnerships, where we know that if it breaks, which it has and it will, and then you fix it, we've got a great set of partners that can work with us to really figure out the technology. So with that, that's a broad set of information, but I was looking forward to taking some tough questions and some from an engaged audience.